Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the Irish American Heritage Museum on what is the 60th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. I'm delighted to have with me, for just a quick catch-up and to mark the anniversary, Martin Wall, who is the Washington correspondent with the Irish Times. He has been with the paper for a long time. He's previously been the industry correspondent and focused particularly on public service reform and industrial relations. And before that, he had also been involved in covering the health service at home in Ireland. So, Martin, thank you very much. I know you've written about this topic for a while, and of course, you've been in Washington for 3 years. So we're just going to kind of talk about JFK's legacy for Ireland, really, and for Irish-American relations, rather than getting into the presidency as such. But just to start us off, I suppose, you know, in the words of Pete Hamill, he wrote a beautiful essay on the occasion of John F. Kennedy's death. He said that John F. Kennedy's election redeemed everything that Irish Catholics had suffered in America. So can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of that election for Ireland and for the Irish here in the States?
Well, I'll start off from Ireland. Good morning. Just to start off from an Irish perspective, Ireland had been, by the time of the 1960 election in the United States, had been independent for nearly 40 years. And in that time, economically, it had not been particularly successful. It had come through a period in the 1950s of mass emigration. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people left, but come to the United States and come to the UK. And suddenly you saw a situation from both an Irish perspective and a Catholic perspective, I think, that you saw a man who was from Irish stock, who from an Irish perspective could be one of them. Granted, he was more glamorous in many ways, and obviously, he was a man who was handsome, had a great smile, was very personable, but at the same time, Irish people could relate to him as one of their own. That his ancestors and distant relatives still lived amongst them in County Wexford. The other part of it was the Catholicism issue. Ireland at the time was, and still is, obviously, a small country, but it was the issue of Catholicism was a worldwide faith, and people could actually align or consider themselves part of a broader community that was bigger than the Irish state or the Irish nation as it is. And here you saw a situation whereby, you know, an Irish Catholic reaching the highest role in the United States. And I suspect in the United States, having come through the situation in the 1928 election and the first Catholic nominee to run for the role, Al Smith, that it was a situation whereby, and the reaction, the backlash to that in the United States, suddenly you had a situation whereby Catholics in the United States could see one of their own reaching the highest office. And similarly, that view was shared in Ireland. So in Ireland, you had it both from a national pride that one of their own was, as they would see it, was in the highest job, and also one of their co-religionists was actually had broken through the barrier and was now at the pinnacle of American politics and world politics, obviously, as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, you know, that probably, I mean, I think Biden is the next Catholic president, so it's not like, you know, it opened floodgates or anything. But I suppose there was a sense, and I don't know if we want to discuss this too much. You know, Irish Americans had been very good at politics, particularly in cities with machines, you know, like Tammany. His election was quite a narrow vote, and we were talking before we came on that actually, you know, he was not necessarily super Irish in his own outlook. So, you know, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think there's we need to distinguish between Irish in heritage and Irish in political outlook. Mm-hmm. Obviously the Kennedy family were Irish in their heritage, and there was no question that. But from a political perspective, you know, the Kennedy family had lived in the UK in the 1930s. It has been said in some historians that he was an Anglophile. Now, I'm not in a position to say whether that's actually true, whether it's not. But the issue is, we have to bear in mind, he was not, let us say, on the question of Irish reunification and on Northern Ireland, he was not an open advocate for the position of the Irish government in the 1960s. The Irish government, I suspect, when Kennedy came to Ireland, and spoke to the Irish Parliament in the Oireachtas in 1963, shortly before his death. The Irish government at the time would have loved to have an American president come and bang the drum in relation to reunification and the need for it and supporting it and whatever. That didn't happen. And if you look in terms of where things happened later, when the Clinton administration defied the John Major government in Westminster to grant a visa to Gerry Adams as part of the peace process, that was a fundamental break with the traditional view of the State Department in Washington, which was largely to support keep in lockstep with London on the bigger geopolitical issues of the day. Look at what the Biden administration did in relation to the issue of Brexit and supporting the Good Friday Agreement and opposing and making it clear that it was opposing any moves by the Boris Johnson administration in London that could undermine the Good Friday Agreement. So the subsequent US administrations adopted, let us say, a more robust stance in relation to their dealings with London on the issues of Northern Ireland and Irish issues than the Kennedy administration would appear to have done in the 1960s.
Yeah, and the visit home, I think, was so moving. And of course, we're all gifted now with 2020 hindsight, and you have to wonder how much of an impact the assassination happening, a short 6 months later. But those few days in Ireland did seem kind of magical. And of course, when any American kind of goes back to their roots, but he seemed to have a very loving, even though they just met, those Wexford cousins, the lady kind of gives out to him pouring the tea, in that short clip that we've seen. He promised to come back in the spring. Sometimes I wonder how aware was he of his image and of cultivating this kind of, he chose to quote from that song, Mavourneen, I'll return in the spring. How aware was he? And later on after his death, Jackie does it too with the whole Camelot thing. Do you think there was a little bit of cultivating an image for himself, or is that just astute politicians at work?
Well, again, you'd have to ask, and I don't know the answer to this question. American presidents tend not to write their own scripts.
Yeah,
they're written part of a team, as part of an administration that provides they don't just turn up on the day. There are advance parties. Everything is prepared in advance. And also, I think to answer that question, I suspect you would have to look in relation to how did the Kennedy administration act in relation to similar visits to other areas, in part of the United States, to other parts of the world. Obviously, there was an Irish issue. As I say, differentiate between Irish heritage and Irish politics. And obviously, he was proud of his Irish roots, as most Americans are who are of Irish ancestry. And from an Irish perspective, you have to bear in mind, as I say, coming from the 1950s, which was dull and drab, and Ireland, in many ways, was one of the last countries to recover economically after the issues of the Second World War. So Ireland was and suddenly you had this glamour. You had a young, fit, handsome president, world leader. I was going to say walking the streets, not walking the streets, but driving through the streets of Ireland. And there would have been nothing like this before. There would have been pieces, if you look back in relation to, parts that's probably glossed over in Irish history as well, is royal visits that were being to Ireland when Ireland was prior to independence. And there would have been, royal visits where there were crowds on the streets in relation to Queen Victoria's visits to Ireland, etc. May not be everywhere, and they may not be certainly universal, but there were in certain parts. And so, but there hadn't been anything like the Kennedy visit previously. And obviously television was there for the first time that people could see this, where you wouldn't have been able to see anything like this previously. So it did electrify the country in relation to, and it was also before the issue of subsequent visits, issues in relation to American foreign policy and opposition to American foreign policy, whether that be in Vietnam, whether that be in the Middle East, whether that be, that was not there to kind of cast a shadow to some degree over the visit, in the way, for example, when Ronald Reagan visited Ireland in the 1980s, there were people who objected or were unhappy with the US policy in Central America, for example. That in the 1960s, I was not there. I was not born at the time, but the issue is that there is no references that I can see to protests of any description in relation to a Kennedy visit. I would imagine that an American president going to any country in the world at the moment, any country, there would not be at least some people protesting or demonstrating about something.
Yeah.
There is no reference to that at all that I've ever seen to anything in relation to the Kennedy visit. So it was virtual universal acclamation by the Irish people, by the Irish government, to a returning son of their own, as they would see it at the time. And as I say, even the issue of whatever they would have liked in relation to a public proclamation in relation to Northern Ireland, that did not get in the way of a the Irish government and the Irish state embracing John Kennedy as he arrived in Ireland in 1963.
Now, you know, Martin, he was notorious for inserting quotations into his speeches and stuff, and you know, apparently he had called
not the last.
No, right. And he had called for, you know, acknowledgement of that there was a mutual dependence between, we'll say, intellectuals and politicians. He revered learning and expertise. And so, you know, now that we're living in a, you could almost say, a post-factual era in American life, or where there's so much misinformation, coupled with the fascination with the assassination, and you wrote about this 2 years ago, the documents, you know, still not being fully released. I know now under the Biden administration, maybe last month, they released another kind of trove of them. What is this hold that the assassination has on the public imagination, whether you're Irish or not?
Well, I think the first part is that this was the Kennedy administration was different in many ways. It, as I say, it was the first probably color television in many ways. It was a televised presidency in the way there was TV obviously before, but this was more people had access to television in the 1960s than had previously. It was a growing medium. People could see them every day. It was a young, glamorous president with a glamorous wife, lovely, beautiful wife and family. And then suddenly that was cut short. It was truncated in a most terrible way. So the issue of John Kennedy's presidency, whether he had been re-elected in 1964, and we can talk about, you know, would-be histories or whatever, that it's difficult to assess the success or otherwise of the Kennedy administration because of it's overshadowed by the ending of it. And then what happened afterwards, and the concept of the lost leader is something that a lot of people and a lot of cultures actually look at. And I think that was the issue. And then it fed into, you know, the Kennedy administration is one of many conspiracy theories that are, and conspiracy theories were always with us. Obviously, with social media, it gives people who support conspiracy theories a greater opportunity to spread those and to mix and meet and talk with people who have similar views. So the issue of the Kennedy administration, it became a huge part of the conspiracy theory lore. What happened? And if you look in terms of the theories, look who is, you know, depending on who you read, it was either the Cubans, the mafia, the CIA, Lyndon Johnson. All of these people have been in the frame in one book or one documentary or one film after another as to what happened to John F. Kennedy. And then the issue that there were thousands and thousands and thousands of classified files, which fed into this myth that, well, somebody in the government in the US government knew what happened to John F. Kennedy, and we're not being told about it. And then the Congress, the US Congress in 1992, probably as a result of the furore that was over the JFK film at the time, the Oliver Stone movie at the time, in relation to that. Historians may question that in relation to its accuracy. But for the public mind, it generated again for a new generation, you know, in relation to what was. So Congress passed a law that by 2017, all government papers were to be on this issue, were to be made public. The Trump administration released some. There were delays. Then COVID came into play and delayed it further. And then the Biden administration in July of in the end of June of 2023, just before the July 4th weekend, which again added to the people who say, oh, this has been done to cover it up and not to signed the final orders and we're releasing whatever we're going to release now. But the critics maintain that there were still about 4,000 documents that were either redacted in full or more likely in part. Now, redactions in part can mean anything. It can basically mean a telephone number being blacked out, an address being blacked out. It doesn't mean that the actual substantive element of the document is not there. And the US, the White House maintained that 99% of all material in relation to the Kennedy assassination records are now in the public domain. The conspiracy theorists will argue, of course, that it's the one document that's redacted that has the key to the entire mystery.
Yeah.
And that's the one we're not seeing. And only earlier this week, Robert Kennedy, obviously the nephew of JFK, who's now running for the White House himself, he and his campaign initiated a petition, a public petition, so basically to get everything out there. Now, the issue will be is that it's how you define redactions from a historical or from a journalistic perspective, and I'm reasonably familiar in terms of dealing with redactions from a journalistic perspective and in relation to freedom of information, material, etc. And there are redactions happen, as I say, for the most mundane reasons. But on the other hand, if you're telling people in the context of a massive conspiracy that we still have documents that we're not showing you, every single document, it is that will just fuel the conspiracy further. Of course, on the other hand, if every document was produced, the conspiracists, I would imagine, would still argue, oh, well, there must be more and we're still not seeing it.
Yeah.
So the schedule that was produced by the government of all the documents, well, that's not accurate, it must be more. So I don't think you will ever get to the bottom of all the documents, and it is so, whether many documents exist or whatever it is. But the Robert Kennedy campaign, they summed it up in a phrase and a question, which will appeal, I would suspect, to many who are even partially interested in this. It just asked, and it said, after 60 years, why can't we see everything? Is there something there that's embarrassing, that is so embarrassing that 60 years after this happened, this terrible event happened, that we cannot see every document that's there? Because by and large, in real life, if you think about it, everyone who was involved on a day-to-day basis in the run-up to that is now probably dead, or
very close to it.
Very close, very, very close to it. So that's an issue. But as I say, there probably needs to be more and better explanation as to what this material was, and issuing a document on the weekend, on the Friday of the bank holiday, of the holiday weekend for the 4th of July, just added to the actual added fuel to what was always going to be an issue for people who believe in that the government knew more than it ought to have known in relation to the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah. And, I'm not putting you on the spot with your personal opinion, but, do you buy that it was Ruby up in the window with one gun and,
to be perfectly honest, I'm not
a forensics expert.
I'm not sufficiently familiar I have read an awful lot in relation to it.
Yeah.
I'm not particularly a ballistics expert in relation to whether a single bolt rifle you could fire that many shots in that many times, or whether there was more. I don't know. I'm not. I have no idea as to whether there was or whether there wasn't. It has created the incident in itself, obviously, has created historians and journalists and academics for 60 years. And probably will into the future in relation to because in many ways people can put forward ideas and argue their theories and argue the theses behind the theories, but you can't definitively disprove them.
Yeah. Either way, Either way. I remember seeing one and that you were thinking, sure, how could it pass through Kennedy and then Connolly in front of him, like his leg and his neck, but I sometimes get the sense myself that they were so panicked on the day. Like one guy said, I think a CIA agent has said recently that he put the bullet, up on the gurney, and it was found later on. And so that might have changed how the trajectory had actually happened because he had moved the bullet, and so I sense that there was just absolute panic. They may not have fully known. And then, when you think about the documents, and you might know this, Martin, I have never looked at those archives, I suppose there probably might be embarrassing things about how underprepared the CIA were, or if they had done investigations into Cuba or the mafia, there may have been things because they're citing national security. So, there must be something that maybe the government did know a little bit more or didn't know enough, and either way, it doesn't look good for the government, I guess.
Yeah, and bureaucracies file material away, and there were several bureaucracies involved, and whether it be the CIA, whether it be the FBI, whether it be the State Department, all have their own archives in relation to this. I'm sure there's archives in relation to the House committees that investigated assassinations in the 1970s. There are archives there, so it's putting all this together and finding material and whatever. And sometimes things get misfiled, sometimes things get lost, sometimes things just don't happen in the way that people think they happen. But it is, and again, as I say, it's impossible to rule out and be definitive to say there was not a conspiracy.
Yeah,
it's easier to say that, to assert that there was, than to prove that there wasn't. So, and if, for example, it ever materialized that there was a second gunman, a second gunman by its nature would mean it was a conspiracy.
Yeah.
The likelihood of two coincidental gunmen appearing at the same location at the same time, whatever, would be a beyond chance. So this is, as I say, it's a subject that will go on indefinitely, and there will be academic conferences, there will be historians arguing, journalists arguing, and members of the public arguing over this backwards and forwards, probably into the future. And as I say, this is now being done. We're talking this here now, 60 years on, for events that we were not around in relation to.
Neither was born. And what has kind of taken a sort of a creepy turn was, I don't know if you're familiar with the QAnon conspiracies about his son, that John Jr. was going to come back and run with, this has just gone on to a whole new dimension now.
Yeah, it is extraordinary to think that people believe, and maybe we'll all be proved wrong. Maybe John Kennedy will turn up at a press conference one day and say, I'm running as Donald Trump's running mate. Maybe that will happen. But it is extraordinary, given that there are a lot of people, maybe not a lot, but there are certainly a cohort of people who believe firmly that John Kennedy Jr. didn't die in the plane crash off New York, that he is actually somewhere in hiding, and that he will return. And again, it's interesting, and we may talk about this in relation to it. The Kennedy family are a Democrat dynasty.
Yeah.
Why would John Kennedy Jr., even if he was alive, why would he be Donald Trump's running mate? That doesn't, I just don't get that in relation to it. As to, all of the evidence that is there is that John Kennedy Jr. died in a plane crash. And even if he didn't, I don't grasp where the jump that even if he was alive, highly unlikely, is that what's the link to Donald Trump? That really doesn't but
compute for me either. No,
it doesn't get. I don't get to that point. But but again, obviously, we see in relation to, we're now seeing in the last couple of months, we move on to the issue of Robert Kennedy. And Robert Kennedy breaking with the Democratic, breaking with the Democratic family of his, the Democratic Party of his family, which his family had been the part of for nearly 100 years. In terms of, and now running against the Democratic president. So, and
they have publicly kind of condemned him for that, which Kennedy sometimes don't, war in public. Yeah,
they have condemned him for that, and they've also condemned him, obviously, for his other claim to fame, largely be his role as a vaccine skeptic. Obviously, and obviously, and to give the man some credit, they did praise him, and many, for his role as an environmental lawyer in the past, in cleaning up rivers and et cetera, in the northeast of the United States. But in relation to his stance vis-a-vis vaccines, and obviously in breaking with the Democratic Party, he has attracted criticism from obviously members of his own family, of his broader family.
Yeah. And so that brings us to actually, Kennedy's, in one way, we could argue about how successful his first or his 1,000 Days in Office war, you know, as you said, we could kind of engage in the what ifs of a second campaign, then followed by Robert and his assassination. And you do get the sense that Robert might have been, you know, capable of doing great things. And then, of course, Teddy and his hopes dashed with Chappaquiddick, although he does go on to become, you know, the Lion of the Senate. What is that, the legacy of the Kennedy kind of curse? And you know, now that you've mentioned Robert Kennedy Jr., you know, a lot of the rest of the Kennedys, Patrick dropped out of politics. You know, Kerry Kennedy is running an NGO. I know Caroline is an ambassador under the Biden administration, but you know,
and Joseph in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, and Joseph, exactly, special envoy. So, you know, how it looks like maybe they're stepping back from politics, but that legacy of the three brothers, you know, kind of tarnished a little bit, or martyred, and now Robert Kennedy Jr.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's you know, as families, you know, where you have initially three brothers, and I suppose even before, you know, there were more other, but there were three brothers. As families evolve, as time goes on, the numbers become involved. And what it does seem to be is, at the moment, is that there is no there's no Kennedy holding national elected office in the United States, and whether it be Congress, whether it be Senate, etc. Obviously, it's public service in a different way, in a different form. As I say, you mentioned that, you know, John Kennedy's daughter, Caroline, is the ambassador to Australia. Joseph Kennedy Jr. is the economic envoy to Northern Ireland. So there is still a link to public service, but whether there will ever be you know, I suppose we don't know in a family that there will be somebody else who would want to run for elective office down the road. The name will help. There's no doubt about that. The name will help in terms of fundraising and you know, support in relation to, or name recognition, etc. Which is hugely important. But whether we ever see another Kennedy running for not only national office, but also be running for the highest office, remains to be seen. Although for the Democratic Party, because obviously we talk about Kennedys having left office, we do have Robert Kennedy running for the presidency, and according to polls, you know, he is 18, 19, 20%, depending on what poll you believe. So you know, it would appear at this point in time, as we say now in November, nearly 11, 12 months out from the election, that it's unlikely that Robert Kennedy is going to be in the White House in January 25. But Robert Kennedy's vote could be a deciding factor in who is in the White House in 2025, and that is an important issue as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us today. I just wanted to kind of mark the anniversary, and we came to this late because we were actually hoping to talk to you next month about something else. And I really appreciate you chatting to us from Washington. Your own work, or that article that you wrote 2 years ago, dealt mostly with the archives. So did you go in and see any, or no?
I saw some online. I didn't actually. A lot of it is actually now available.
Online, good.
And as I say, reading archive documents is it's not that, you know, there's a folder that says the most important ones are here.
I know, and then with the redactions too, it's
you have to be of a certain mind to read through days and days, and in many cases it's a wild goose chase, because firstly you don't know what you're looking for. In relation to it. So it's and the numbers are vast in terms of thousands and thousands of documents. As I say, it doesn't exactly say, you know, there's not an index that says,
here's the smoking gun.
The smoking gun is on the bottom of page 46. You know, it doesn't really work. So you have to just it's potluck in many ways in relation to it.
And you just weren't obsessed enough to to wade through.
Unfortunately, I don't have the time to.
No, you're on deadline.
There's other elements of my life and work to do with that.
So just final words then on JFK 60 years later. You know, today is obviously a sad day still, I think, for many Americans, because of that kind of potential of what was lost. Not just Irish Americans, but what are your final words?
The assassination 60 years ago was an inflection point in American history, in modern American history. And as I say, no more than we can spend hours and hours and hours arguing or talking and debating in relation to the who was responsible for the death. We could also look in relation to what came after. For example, would Vietnam, in the escalation of of the Vietnam situation. Would that have happened in a second John F. Kennedy administration post 1964? You know, others will argue that it was Kennedy who initially sent special advisors to Vietnam. The large numbers of ground troops came later. How would that have worked? We will never know. Obviously, but it's a fascinating debate in relation to it. What would have been the situation in relation to, civil rights in the United States? What would have happened if Bobby Kennedy had been elected in 1968 in relation to, where would that? There wouldn't have been Watergate, all of that, and what spawned into that, into the 1970s in the United States. So there is, as I say, the concept in many cultures of a lost leader. We have it in Ireland in relation to Michael Collins, etc., in relation to what could have been. Fascinates people, and I think that is the situation, obviously writ large on a world scale or on a world stage, in relation to John F. Kennedy and subsequently Bobby Kennedy, as to what actually would have been if you had theoretically 16 years of Kennedy administration passed on from one to the other in the 1960s and 70s. What world would we have had at the end of that, and how different would it be to the world we actually have today?
Yeah, that's a kind of a sobering thought, because, as you say, and as a historian, of course, I should never engage in these thought experiments, but, given how idealistic he was on one hand, and, the looks are that he wanted to pull out of Vietnam, but felt he didn't have the right to, because he had such a slim majority. And yet, he hadn't really passed a lot of things in Congress, and particularly with the civil rights, so I think you're right. Obviously we'll just never know. And that's kind of what's so bittersweet about it, I think, because we can tell ourselves there would have been a better, tomorrow kind of thing. So on that depressing note, thank you very much, Martin, and enjoy Washington. And we're back next week, guys, with on Monday night, a talk about the Irish and the Native Americans. So thank you very much. I'll just